So Christoph, we've all seen the headlines. NVIDIA calling this an inflection point. Time saying the quantum era's already has begun. But is this hype or is it a real paradigm shift?
Yeah, good question. And hi, Andreas. Thanks for having me. Yeah, we've seen that, these kind of headlines for a while. I think that's, and some people even say that's always the technology that's coming in 5 or 10 years. So it's really a legitimate question to ask oneself, is it really the beginning of something? Are we at the inflection point as the quantum era began? So showing a couple of illustrations here, but we've seen that over time. We are investors in quantum technologies at Quantum Nation, and I'm deeply convinced, indeed, this is the time. We have invested since 2018. I came back into the sector since 2016. And I want to show you a couple of funny pictures, maybe to start with, because I think that's really important. What you need to have in this kind of sector is really the expertise to understand at what stage you are. Here is a picture of me somewhere with a little bit more hair here on the right, with Professor Aspe with the mustache on the left. He's the Nobel Prize 2022 for quantum physics. And I was doing my PhD at the time in the 90s in a physics labs, turning the knobs, adjusting lasers and these things. So really the beginning of quantum applications, really. Quantum science is much older, obviously. And then fantastic thing is that 30 years later, that's a picture we took last year. It's me again with Professor Aspect after Nobel Prize in 2022, and he's working with us. Industry has dramatically changed, whereas in the 90s, we were doing science, very fundamental things. It's really too much of a view on what it would be good for. Now, these days, there are startups in that sector. So there are young people, like the one on the picture, who take a job in quantum technologies, quantum startups, quantum funds. And Alain, we're very fortunate to have him still with us. And a message I want to give, maybe to start with, and we'll illustrate that with a couple of applications, which I think make a lot of sense, is that this is a science that's relatively old. It's beginning of the 20th century. Everybody knows this picture from the Solvay conference, 1927. You see very familiar faces, Einstein, Marie Curie, Schrödinger, Heisenberg, etc. So the science is relatively old. Well, it's mature. It's 100 years, actually. We're celebrating that this year, 2 years earlier than that. That's a year of quantum, officially, for United Nations. But what is really interesting and important is that now, in 2025, we start really to develop applications in a way in the operating system of the world, which is quantum mechanics, not Newtonian physics, 18th century or even earlier, 18th, 19th, and 20th century classical mechanics. Now, we can leverage this science, we can build applications in compute, sensing, and I think that's the inflection point people are talking about. That's why it's so exciting. And we definitely see an acceleration in science. We need a lot of fundamental science, hardware, machines, engineering, and also applications. Now that I've introduced you to this idea of the world operating system based on quantum mechanics, I want to show a few applications that our portfolio companies in the fund on in 4 sectors: healthcare, energy, security, climate, shown here. And we'll talk about AI a little bit later, and I'll have more to say about that. But these ones, I think, are pretty spectacular. These are real things, real applications companies are working on. This is not science fiction. That's the important thing to keep in mind. So the 4 segments I want to talk about, so health, energy, security, climate, a bit about compute as well, giving some example of companies and markets. So the first one in healthcare, it's actually a use case, 2 companies in our portfolio, Pascal, which is a quantum computing company, hardware, and Qubit Pharmaceuticals, which is a software company, are working on. They're using quantum processors to design molecules for new drugs. They use the power of quantum computers that are inherently good at doing simulation of chemistry in order to develop new molecules that would be less toxic, more effective, better, let's say, impact on the target. And above all, also, they're using, so Pascal and Qubit, this technology to shorten the time it takes to develop a molecule. Instead of doing lots of experimentations, you can substitute part of it with a compute part, so-called in silico, and reduce with classical and quantum computers the time to deliver these molecules. This is still early days, but we have good evidence that using quantum computers here, we get to new molecules, new materials as well. This is a use case which I think is definitely the most important in the short term, to get materials for catalysts, for example, new forms of catalysts. And that's really let's say, in a way, the killer app for quantum computing, in my opinion, in the short term, designing molecules. And of course, the markets are really big, a couple $100 billion at some point. It is very small market for now, but it's true for everything in quantum. But it's poised to grow quite a bit over the next couple of years as soon as we will have better machines and better software as well.
Can you describe in a little more detail what is that revolution here, so to say? Why is it that the application of AI or the coupling of AI and quantum is actually so powerful?
A very recent development that's made by Qubit Pharmaceuticals, again, company in our portfolio. They're based in France and in the US. The team is strong of about 50 people. The computational chemists, they're developing molecules. So they have shown a few months ago that you can use classical, so GPUs, and quantum processors in order to generate so-called synthetic data to train foundation models. And ultimately, to have an agent and be very expert at quantum chemistry is going to be able to generate new molecules. The novelty here is that you can use these technologies of compute to train the model. Usually people were doing, let's say, more traditional simulations, simulate directly the chemistry in stick mode. So you simulate the chemistry, the reaction, the dynamics, and you get the end result. Here, the new thing that they have shown, which in my mind is very, very important and will have a quite profound impact, that you can use even relatively imperfect quantum computers. So the ones we have now that are not completely mature, hundreds of qubits I mentioned earlier, tens of qubits even, without error correction, might come into it, but you can use these machines as they are to generate data and train a model. It's not an LLM like we have in a large language model. It's a different form of model. It's a foundation model. That's what it's called. That's going to be a top expert in quantum chemistry. So this combination of training the model with quantum is very new. In the words of one of the founders of Qubit, it's going to accelerate the adoption of quantum computers by 5 years, he said. I tend to believe that it's true, actually. That's the kind of combination using classical, quantum, AI together in a very in a good synergy that's going to get to accelerate adoption and get to have more applications in the short term.
Maybe you can talk a bit about the importance of coming from a quantum background or truly understanding quantum if you want to be a successful investor in this space.
One of the biggest challenges for making investments in quantum, and back to the first things we've discussed, is really to make for investor to be able to make a difference between what's hype, so pure speculation and fantasy in many ways, and what's real. How to make the distinctions is really hard for venture capital in particular. So you can ask experts, of course, you can ask scientists to help you understand, but usually pure scientists, I mean, they don't necessarily, they're missing a little bit, I would say they lack a little bit of imagination, because you need to have a bit of imagination to figure out what the technology will be good for without hiding the challenges. So if you focus too much on the challenges, you're not going to develop new applications. And if you're a little bit too speculative, you overlook the challenges. So what we're doing, I think the way to go is definitely in a venture fund that's interested in investing in quantum science, in deep tech in general. I think it's really have to have in the team, in particular in the investment committee, team members who have a background in the science, actually, in physics. So at Quantum Nation, we have 3 partners, and it's a good combination because we have 2. I've done a PhD in quantum physics in the end of the 90s with Alain Aspect, another partner with Zeng, who's done his PhD in the UK, in Oxford, and has worked in a quantum startup as well, hardware and software before joining the fund. And Olivier Tonneau, who has more of a more classical VC background. So this combination is great, but it's in the investment committee. It's not just a question of advisor. I mean, you need to form a vision, of a conviction, and I think that's what is really key in what we're doing. And that's something I'd like to see more in VCs. Get the expertise very deeply into the team so that there's really a true ambition and a true vision on the application of these technologies, not just consulting experts who get you to make a decision. And that's very, very important, particularly if you want to be a lead investor, lead followers, and of course, that's different. So investors who want to have access into quantum as a follower, I think you don't necessarily need that, I will agree, to have a very strong expertise. But if you want to be a lead investor, and we need more lead investors, in particular in Europe, I think it's really important to have the expertise into the team.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say that I frown on people that really think that they can diligence their way through something difficult by using consultants or advisors, because it is wrought with a lot of problems. And I have at least personally seen how researchers can have very differing views, and they, like, we've seen so many cases where the obviously the professors and the so-called experts are completely unable to see what the founders are able to see. And I think that as a VC investing in this space, you got to have that taste, you got to have that understanding yourself, so you can go and live the world of the founder, so to say, because otherwise you're not going to be, like, you cannot expect a researcher, despite them being experts, to be able to go into a founder's vision and view on things. Also because it's often contrarian. So by definition, if you go to a broad group, then you should get, or to an expert that is very much an expert in the usual world, you will automatically get the wrong conclusion.
Yeah, and I think I'd like to build on that a little bit, because I think that's a very topic as well. I want to show you a couple of things about one of our portfolio companies, which is called Pascal in quantum computing. So it's developing machines, quantum hardware. See on the picture here, this is a quantum computer. A real one is a supercomputing center. There's one in France that has been installed. There's one in Germany, in Jülich, close to Cologne, that's being installed at the moment. There will be in Italy, Saudi Arabia, etc. So we're very far from the lab. I think it started in the lab, 2019, with researchers. Now we're building, shipping machines, putting them in planes, sending them all over the world, installing. That's challenging. But then you have access through the cloud, etc. The thing I want to mention is that what I've been impressed with is that I think scientists don't underestimate a little bit the power of engineering, actually. So once you have the science done, it takes a lot of time, decades, and we need more fundamental science. But then after that, and that's what I've seen at Pascal, a really impressive way they have been able to integrate the components, make it reliable. And once you're there, you have let's say, again, maybe this notion of inflection point is valid here as well. Once you have this engineered device, I think things get much faster, actually. Scientists tend to underestimate the power of engineering and what startups can do. And I think that to me is amazing. With engineering, with VC, with kind of thing that we're doing, I see companies progressing even much faster than I would have anticipated a couple of years ago. And that's the thing that's happening in the quantum field now, putting bright minds, putting money, of course, into these companies, also combining different kind of talents. What's really key, what you can do in a startup very well is combining computer scientists with physicists, for example, and working together on applications. That's also something that Pascal is doing on graph machine learning, this kind of thing. It's really hard to do in the lab or in the academic world. Interdisciplinarity is not something that's easy to deal with. In a company, I'd say, well, literally, you put the people in the same room and you ask them to work together. Computer science with physics is very, very powerful, I think, and that's the way to go for applications in particular.
I'd love to ask you about the financing risk of this space. Is there enough capital? Because when you come in as a believer like you, it can be tempting, to bet on a technology that the rest of the market is not there yet.
So there's enough and not enough. So, but in different ways, I'd say, for quantums. So, first, the thing to keep in mind that this sector has started relatively recently. So, I tend to put the starting point in 2016 when IBM put a couple of qubits online, and their machine was accessible for people to program, work with, and the ecosystem was developed around that. And I mean, for me, that was one of the drivers for me to come back from where I was in renewable energy, actually, at the time, back to quantum, because I felt like, something had happened. It was maybe also an inflection point, a different one, but that was definitely for me an eye-opener. So 16, 17. And then we started investing at Quantum in 2018, so very early, because we had this strong conviction that the operating system of the world was quantum, and then it was the right time to get in. It started heating up for VC, venture capital, a bit later, 2021, 2022, about 2 billion, 2 billion and a half of VC money getting into quantum. It seems big, but it's not actually. I think like when you look at AI, it's hundreds of billions of dollars from VC money that's going into quantum. So still relatively small, but things are progressing. So 23 for everybody has been a little bit tough, but this year, 24 and 25, we see really an increase of capital investments in quantum. I think half of the year we're already at 2.5 billion this year in 2025. So probably we'll get 5 billion, so a radical increase, doubling pretty much of capital that's going into quantum this year. One reason for that is that companies are maturing, so getting to Series B, Series C, the rounds are bigger, and therefore they need more capital. But again, it's not enough in the sense of, I think there's a bit of a lack of late-stage venture capital for quantum, in particular in Europe. There are many good companies. Europe has been very strong at developing an ecosystem in quantum technology, combining public and private capital, a European flagship, a very strong ecosystem for deep tech VC in many countries, France, Germany, now Italy as well, also in the Netherlands, UK, obviously, and Nordic. I mentioned them, and now Spain as well with Multiverse. So very strong in the early stages. I tend to say even because we're also investors in the US or other parts of the world, Australia. In Europe, it's definitely very strong and very well positioned for early stage. Where capital is missing, in particular for European startups, it's really later stage, growth, deep tech, Series B plus, where you need to build rounds at 100, 200 million around, and above all, find a lead investor who has the conviction get there, because where it's tricky is that obviously there are revenues for these companies and it's in the tens of millions, so it starts to be substantial, and it's not grants, it's revenues, procuring machines and services, software applications, etc. But you have to find investors who have a strong conviction to issue a term sheet and be a lead for these kind of deals, and then you find investors to follow and interested in being in.